Chinese cars are cheap, unsafe death traps. That's why they're banned in the US. That's what you've been told. It's not the full story. The reality is less about safety and more about protecting a trillion-dollar auto industry. A $12,000 EV with top safety ratings wouldn't just compete, it would blow up the entire US car market overnight. Detroit would be bankrupted. So the US has built one of the most aggressive protectionist barriers in modern history to keep them out. The result is a financial iron curtain that'll trap the middle classes in record-high auto loans averaging $767 a month for the next 6 years. And that's not even the worst part. Because while American families are worrying about how they're going to cover the cost of their family SUV, the country's automotive industry is preparing for something bigger. A digital Pearl Harbor, where every car on the highway simply stops moving. The American driveway has become a financial crime scene. The average transaction price for a new vehicle has crossed the $50,000 mark. If you want a truck or an SUV, you often have to pay significantly more than that. The Ford F-150 Raptor can cost around $80,000. A fully loaded 2026 Chevy Suburban High Country can hit into the six figures. Even more mainstream family vehicles come with price tags of around $40,000 to $60,000, and that is before financing even comes into play. Because the vast majority of people can't afford to buy a new car outright. Instead, they'll opt to pay for it through loans and leases, and those financing options come with interest rates, which can dramatically increase the overall price you pay for the car you drive. By late 2025, the average new car payment reached a jaw-dropping $767 per month. Many buyers are stretching their loans and lease agreements out as long as they possibly can, sometimes as far as 72, 84, or even 96 months, all to keep the rates semi-affordable. 96 months is 8 years. That means some Americans are financing their vehicles for almost an entire decade because they have no other option. Car finance plans are literally outlasting marriages in some cases. It's the younger generations who are being hit the hardest. Statistics show that Gen Z drivers aged between 18 and 28 have reached an auto loan delinquency rate of 7.5%. That is significantly higher than the national average of 5.1%. That is the highest level of borrower distress seen in over a decade. To give you some idea of just how bad the situation has become, take every single delinquent car currently moving toward repossession or already in default. Park them bumper to bumper, and you would have an unbroken line of steel stretching from New York City to Los Angeles. The effects of this will be felt for decades to come. Millions of young Americans are forced to watch their credit scores plummet and their financial futures break down before they have barely even taken the first steps into the professional world. The reason so many have been bound to these multi-year loans for vehicles they can barely afford is because they haven't been given any other option. They've been led to believe that no other option exists. But it does. The alternative is out there on the other side of the world. In China, the automotive industry is almost like a parallel universe when compared to its American counterpart. Their vehicles, electric vehicles to be precise, are available for incredibly low prices. In 2023, one of China's top car brands, BYD, launched the Seagull, an electric hatchback that retails for less than $10,000 domestically and is available for around $20,000 in international markets like Mexico or Europe. This isn't some stripped-down bare-bones vehicle. It is a modern, sophisticated car, boasting fast charging times, proven safety systems, and a range of up to 250 miles. And you could buy 5 of those cars for the same price that you'd have to spend on a single average American SUV. Even the international prices, which come with the added costs of tariffs, shipping, and dealer margins, the cost is significantly cheaper than what you'd pay in the US. So why isn't it available? Well, the US government would argue that modern electric vehicles are vastly different from conventional cars. They're not just made up of motors and brakes and transmissions. They're kitted out with advanced electronic equipment, including cameras, sensors, microphones, and telematics. They are smartphones on wheels. And that scares the US government. They believe that the remote connectivity could be exploited by China or other foreign agents to spy on American citizens or disrupt the country's infrastructure. The government imagines a fearful future scenario in which Beijing has the power to push some sort of kill switch and instantly disable millions of vehicles on America's roads. So American consumers find themselves lumbered with life-altering debt, forced to buy vehicles that drain their bank accounts for years on end, and meanwhile the vastly more affordable alternative is regarded by Washington as some sort of terrifying weapon of war. How did this happen, and how did a consumer product designed for the daily commute become classified as a threat to national security? In 2024, the United States government imposed an eye-watering 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. 100%. It was a complete economic blockade, a dramatic doubling of the cost of these cars for American buyers. The intention was clear: deliberately make China's EVs instantly unviable in the American market. Because if one of those cars costs around $20,000 normally, and this 100% tariff adds $10,000 to its wholesale cost basis, the price tag becomes $30,000, and then all of a sudden a car that would have seemed remarkably cheap and attractive starts to look out of reach for some. In other words, it is doomed to fail. Meanwhile, the American brands continue to monopolize the market. Imagine stepping into your local grocery store to see that the price of a loaf of bread had suddenly spiked by 50%. And imagine that the government says that it's imposed that price change to protect your local bakery, which charges $15 a loaf. That's effectively what happened here. And the speed and intensity of this decision revealed how terrified Washington was of these cheap Chinese cars, because it's not normal trade policy to impose such extreme tariffs on foreign products. 100% tariffs are generally regarded as extreme measures reserved for genuine emergencies. But according to Washington, this was an emergency. The government argued that it would be detrimental to allow such low-cost cars into the market. Its argument centered on the idea that China provided extremely high levels of subsidies and other state support to its automotive companies. And there is some truth to that. Beijing did subsidize its EV industry quite aggressively. It spent years and huge amounts of money building up the infrastructure needed to power its EV revolution. That included battery manufacturing plants and industrial-scale charging systems. But here's the part that Washington glossed over. The U.S. also heavily subsidizes its auto industry. It provides literally billions of dollars worth of subsidies through the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. There's also massive manufacturing grants for the big dogs of the industry like Ford and GM. There is also up to $7,500 in tax credits for consumers who buy domestically made vehicles. The big auto firms received enormous and low-interest loans to help them invest in EV technologies. It effectively shifted the risk of the EV transition away from those companies and onto the American taxpayers. So while the government was criticizing China over its subsidies, it was guilty of doing the exact same thing. It was never about subsidies are bad. It was always about China's subsidies could threaten our subsidies. So we come to the frightening truth. The end of free market capitalism in the American automotive sector. It's no longer a battle between brands to see which ones deliver the most efficient engineering or who can optimize their manufacturing to produce the very best cars at the very best prices. It is something much uglier, a market manipulated by the American government. Washington is picking and choosing the winners of its automotive industry. It's building financial fortresses around them to keep everyone else out. It makes false claims about fair play and safety, but ultimately the only reason the tariff exists is to make sure American consumers can only buy EVs subsidized by Washington. But if it's not about fair competition, who actually demanded this 100% wall? Think of the American automotive industry, and three big names immediately come to mind: General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, the parent company of well-known brands like Chrysler and Jeep. Together, they represent the empire of Detroit. For decades, they dominated the auto market. They shaped the face of suburban America, controlled the roads, and impacted entire regional economies. And as they grew bigger and wealthier, their power grew with them. Before long, they weren't just impacting towns and cities, but entire states. This in turn increased their political influence in D.C. As time went by, these companies used their influence and wealth to rewrite the rules of the American auto market in ways that would make them even more money. That meant a gradual shift away from affordable passenger cars toward larger, heavier, and more luxurious vehicles. It happened slowly, but as the years passed, certain kinds of cars began to vanish from the nation's roads. Small sedans and compact hatchbacks disappeared, along with other entry-level vehicles that are common in other countries around the world. The Big Three shifted toward larger vehicles with larger profit margins. As far as their bottom lines were concerned, this shift made a lot of sense. Companies like Ford make far more money selling full-size pickup trucks and premium SUVs than they ever would selling simple family hatchbacks. By focusing more on these high-margin vehicles and phasing out the smaller alternatives, they left buyers with fewer and fewer options. Eventually, they reached the stage they'd always dreamed of. Everyone had to buy a $50,000 car if they wanted to get from point A to point B. But this entire model and the very survival of the Big Three firms was dependent on ensuring that no cheaper competitors were able to enter the market. There could be no other affordable option for the American public. Then along came Chinese EV manufacturers offering vehicles like the Seagull, all for the low price tags of around $12,000. America's auto industry can't compete with that. The Big Three weren't going to let that happen, so they started to leverage that power that they'd amassed in Washington over the years. They used every weapon in their arsenal and every trick in their playbook to preserve the status quo. It ultimately boiled down to pouring massive amounts of money into lobbying efforts aimed at the likes of Senate subcommittees and executive policymakers. Their objective was clear: keep China out. To do that, they framed Chinese EVs not just as an economic challenge, but as an industrial invasion, one that America needed to defend itself against. They warned of a solar panel-style collapse of the automotive industry, reminding lawmakers of how cheap Chinese solar panel systems entered the U.S. market. Local brands were undercut and the domestic solar sector was effectively wiped out. They said the exact same situation would happen in the automotive industry, but on an even larger scale. Assembly lines that had been running for decades in Detroit and elsewhere would go dark and millions of jobs would be lost. But Detroit couldn't just come out and say, "We don't want those cheap Chinese cars coming here because we can't compete with them." They needed a more concrete and convincing argument, something that could really resonate with the public. And they found it. Ask the average American what they think about Chinese cars, and many would undoubtedly bring up the topic of safety. They might talk about how Chinese companies cut corners. They might mention the dangerous batteries that can blow up at any time, or even the lack of rigorous security tests. Some would even describe Chinese cars as death traps. These ideas and stereotypes are deeply ingrained in the American media landscape and the wider public perception of Beijing's automotive industry. And there's a reason for that. But it's not the one you've been led to believe. Sure, there were early catastrophic failures like zero-star crash tests and cabin collapses in 2005, but it's also the result of years of propaganda and brainwashing campaigns bought and paid for by Detroit automotive giants. For years, Ford, GM, and others built and spread the narrative that China's cars were unsafe. It was an incredibly useful narrative for them. Fear is a powerful force. If people were frightened of Chinese vehicles, they'd never want to buy one. What's more, they would more than happily agree to pay a significantly higher price for cars with a Made in the USA sticker on the back. That extra $20,000 or $30,000 was the cost of keeping their family safe. Suddenly, companies like Ford looked noble and honorable. They were going the extra mile to protect their drivers and passengers. Chinese firms were painted as the evil, money-hungry ones, shunning safety in favor of cheaper and easier to manufacture. And that all falls apart when you look closer. The myth of the dangerous Chinese car was well and truly shattered when vehicles like the BYD Dolphin and the Auto 3 entered the highly regulated European market. If they really were death traps on wheels, they would have zero chance of being sold in places like France and Germany. If the stereotypes were true, these cars would fail the European New Car Assessment Program. It is one of the most comprehensive vehicle safety checks in the entire world. They didn't. They passed it with flying colors. Both the Dolphin and the Auto 3 earned 5-star in-cab safety ratings. They either matched or even exceeded the scores of some of America's best-rated vehicles, like the Ford Mustang Mach-E and the Tesla Model 3. As far as exploding batteries were concerned, That myth got busted too. BYD's own Blade battery essentially passed the industry's standard nail penetration test. It's designed to simulate the type of damage that can cause batteries to suddenly burst into flames. The Chinese manufacturer even shared footage online showing nails entering its battery cells without them catching fire. It was a feat that many of the Western world's NMC batteries were unable to replicate. The vehicles passed test after test and met one safety standard after another, and the unsafe Chinese car narrative fell apart. That's not to say that the Chinese cars are perfect or that none of them have any safety concerns whatsoever. There are always areas for improvement, but what the tests revealed was that Chinese cars were no more dangerous than American ones. In many aspects, they were even safer. With the safety myth destroyed, the government needed a new, unassailable reason to keep these cars out of the U.S. Enter the Trojan horse. As the economic and safety-related arguments began to crumble, Washington orchestrated a swift and surprising pivot in an even more extreme direction. It began to argue that Chinese cars were a threat to national security. While that might sound ludicrous, DC's argument was put together in a cold and calculated fashion. It leveraged decades of public indoctrination and widely held fears about China, its ruling Communist Party, and the threat it posed to the American way of life. The groundwork was laid in 2024. The U.S. Department of Commerce, DOC, carried out an investigation into the so-called systemic risks posed by connected vehicles originating in China and other countries that could be classified as adversaries of the United States. The findings of that investigation were alarming. The DOC explained in excruciating detail how modern vehicles could be mobilized into platforms of cyber warfare. The investigators theorized a nightmare scenario, a kind of digital Pearl Harbor in which Beijing would hold the power to disrupt American society on an unprecedented scale. Let's say tensions ramp up in the South China Sea. The long-awaited Chinese invasion of Taiwan begins. At that very same moment, in the United States, hundreds of thousands or even millions of American citizens sit behind the wheels of their Chinese EVs. To ensure that America doesn't interfere with its immediate invasion plans, China's intelligence agency could deploy a malicious over-the-air software payload to every single one of these vehicles. Programmed to bypass the usual systems, the payload would be immediately downloaded and installed in each car. Within seconds, they would become utterly and entirely immobile. Steering systems would lock up, electronic parking brakes would engage, power inverters would shut down. Drivers would lose control of their cars before they knew what was going on. In the blink of an eye, countless vehicles traveling across highways like the I-95 or the labyrinth-like arteries of downtown Manhattan would all seize up, all frozen by some invisible but all-powerful force. It would be catastrophic infrastructure paralysis. There would be accidents, injuries, death, destruction. Emergency services would struggle to respond. Shipping corridors would be choked and impassable. Logistics would collapse. The domestic economy would collapse. It might sound exaggerated, but the technology exists. Cars today are fitted with complex webs of electronic control units and networking devices. They have the power to collect and share countless pieces of data. Every single second, they rely on software to control every core feature and functionality, from the steering assist to the power distribution system. And ultimately, the brands that make these cars hold the power to control exactly how they work. They are the ones who can make and deploy important firmware updates. So it's not all that crazy to imagine how that sort of power could be used in a dangerous or destructive way. And once that idea is out there, DC has the justification it needs to effectively ban these vehicles. The big three get what they want while building a narrative that this is all for the public good. But tariffs only apply to cars shipped from China. So what happens when the cars are being built right next door? With the tariff wall in place, it looked like the U.S. government had won. It had made it all but impossible for Beijing to bring its EVs into the American market and have even a slight chance of competing with the likes of Ford and General Motors. At least that's how it seemed. But China wasn't going to give it up that easily. It didn't take long for Beijing's strategists to spot a loophole. They realized that the 100% tariffs applied based on strict country of origin rules for manufacturing and major components. That meant assembling cars in Mexico only bypasses taxes if enough parts are made locally, not just by avoiding Chinese ports. So, if it can make and export them from somewhere much closer to home for the American consumer, then those tariffs would in effect be nullified. So the big Chinese brands like BYD and MG started to look south to Mexico. They made plans and quickly put them into action. They agreed on land deals and broke ground on brand new multi-billion-dollar automotive manufacturing plants on Mexican soil, just a short distance from the U.S. border. From a business perspective, it was a stroke of genius. Mexico is already a major automotive manufacturing hub. It has reasonably cheap labor and a proven track record of shipping vehicles into the U.S. From a legal perspective, the move made a lot of sense too. It was a calculated play on China's part to bypass the legal architecture of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, the modern-day successor to NAFTA. According to the provisions set out in the USMCA, any automobile manufactured in one of the three signatory nations can cross the borders of the other nations duty-free, but it has to follow certain rules and requirements. Each vehicle must derive 75% of its components and structural value from North American labor and materials. By bringing its manufacturing infrastructure to Mexico, making use of local steel and relying on Mexican assembly workers, Beijing was confident it could easily pass the 75% restriction. The cars turned from Chinese imports to North American products. It was like China had found a secret backdoor into the American market. And if this plan worked, it would soon be able to make vehicles like the BYD Seagull in Mexico, transport them over the border into Texas, all while paying zero taxes in the process. Again, the U.S. was desperate to stop this from happening. A desperate scramble broke out in the offices of the United States Trade Representative, or USTR. Washington diplomats reached out to their Mexican counterparts, and they argued if these Chinese Trojan horses entered their territory, they'd be in direct violation of the spirit of the USMCA. They even threatened to deploy aggressive measures in response. This included the possible invocation of the USMCA's sunset clause, which could lead to the entire agreement being torn apart. It would have disastrous consequences for the Mexican economy. Mexico relented. The government began pulling back some of the incentives it had previously offered to Chinese auto firms. Suddenly, it was trickier and harder for them to set up their facilities inside the country. While some of those companies announced that they were pausing their Mexican plans, others went ahead with the expansion. The future remains increasingly uncertain, with a very real possibility that more Chinese auto plants will inevitably appear in Mexico. But even if the cars are assembled in Mexico, the software that powers them will still be controlled in Shenzhen. Which brings us to the root cause of the entire ban. Trade disputes, corporate lobbying, and public relations campaigns are all just background noise. The deepest, darkest underlying cause of the industrial conflict is down to geopolitical drama. We're witnessing a dramatic, generational, and irreversible shift on the global stage. The gradual but definitive decoupling of the United States and China. Both nations have had their disagreements over the years, but they have tended to put those issues to the side to enjoy the benefits of globalized trade. Consumer goods are able to flow easily across oceans and beyond borders based purely on the rules of supply and demand. Political posturing or disagreements are pushed to the side. Until now. It's being replaced by something very different. An era in which the world's greatest powers aren't interested. They want competition. In this new age, the humble automobile has undergone a profound transformation. It's turned from a mechanical product into a software-defined asset. The cars of today are networked sensor arrays operating within physical and digital boundaries dictated by their manufacturer, and state powers support and subsidize those manufacturers. Whoever controls the software and operating systems of those vehicles ultimately holds a significant amount of leverage over their users. That reveals a frightening truth. Automotive companies today, no matter whether they're American, Chinese, or European, all have the power to remotely brick vehicles from across the globe. And the repercussions are huge. Let's say a consumer defaults on their car lease or a vehicle is reported as stolen. The corporation behind it can simply issue a command from hundreds or even thousands of miles away and bring it to a sudden stop. With the click of a mouse or the tap of a screen, these companies can turn $50,000 vehicles into immobile blocks of plastic and metal. The infrastructure is there. It's integrated into every new EV as it rolls off the assembly lines. This is the genuine threat facing America. According to Chinese law, all domestic corporate entities and citizens, are legally obligated to support, assist, and cooperate with national intelligence efforts. If a car company like BYD or Geely is contacted by the CCP and asked to share access to its networks of real-time location data, camera feeds, interior recordings, or even remote vehicle control systems, it can't refuse. It has to comply. This potentially puts the Chinese government in charge of millions of vehicles in dozens of countries worldwide. It is the digital Pearl Harbor scenario, but worse. China doesn't just have the power to shut down these vehicles if and when it wants. It could also turn them into intelligence-gathering assets. The cars could harvest everything from biometrics to acoustic data from their customers. It's easy to imagine how such immense power might be misused. It is an unprecedented threat that no sovereign superpower can possibly allow. So Washington's ban on China's vehicles isn't the product of paranoia, after all, nor is it entirely about keeping the market in the hands of the bigger domestic brands. It is, at its core, a national security decision. It's about the U.S. locking the gates against a potentially existential threat. And so far it's succeeded. But at what cost? Because in blocking out these vehicles, we may have sabotaged our future in the process. The climate crisis, net zero, renewable energy. For years now, and with increasing regularity, the American public has heard these terms repeated ad nauseum by politicians and policymakers. They have been lectured about the perils of global warming and the importance of shifting away from fossil fuels. Yet, at the highest levels in the halls of power itself, the American political machine has operated in a blatantly hypocritical and contradictory way. It's saying one thing, but doing the exact opposite. Policymakers say that they're committed to these ambitious environmental frameworks and to the concept of net zero by 2050. They share plans for mass-scale adoption of electric vehicles to help decarbonize the transportation sector and slash emissions. Yet, their decisions paint a different story. When those same people were confronted with a choice between achieving their eco-friendly goals and maintaining some sort of nebulous protectionist posture against China, they chose the latter, without a moment of hesitation. They erected a tariff wall, and in doing so, they didn't just ban Chinese cars. They systematically outlawed the world's most efficient supply of clean energy transport. That wouldn't matter so much if the U.S. was already on the way toward matching China's EV infrastructure. But it's not. It's miles behind. Research models suggest that Washington policies, restrictions on affordable imports, and raw material constraints are slowing electric vehicle adoption in the United States. As a result, the projected timeline for reaching 50% electric vehicle adoption in new passenger vehicle sales has been pushed back from 2034 to 2039. With the rate the climate crisis is evolving, 5 years isn't a small period of time, it's enormous. And it'll have massive consequences for the environment. During that time, millions more internal combustion engines will be made, sold, and driven along American roads. They will burn through billions of gallons of fossil fuels and pump metric tons of carbon dioxide and pollutants into the atmosphere. The hypocrisy is transparent. The state says it wants to save the planet, but it has made it impossible for citizens to buy the affordable vehicles required to do so, just because they happen to come from China. The fact is, if Chinese cars were allowed into the market, people would buy them. That would be better for the well-being of the planet. Instead, people are faced with a choice between conventional SUVs or the even more expensive American EVs. They don't have the financial luxury to afford these expensive models, so the negative effects of fossil fuel cars continue to perpetuate. In banning the $12,000 EV, the U.S. government has turned the green transition from a mass market movement into a luxury lifestyle statement. It's reserved exclusively for the upper middle class. The average American consumer is told to do their bit while actively being priced out of the opportunity. They're forced to stand on the sidelines and watch the world burn. They've become the ultimate casualty in a war they never wanted. The United States has made a definitive choice that will resonate for years to come. Washington had the opportunity to push an affordable green revolution, one that would unite the global economy. Instead, it's decided to shut the gates, lock the doors, and develop a high-cost, high-debt fortress economy. The era of the affordable American car is well and truly over. It has been liquidated part by part. In its place sits a new system, one with a $25,000 price floor that's manipulated to keep the average American stuck in endless cycles of high-interest loans over and over again. A new iron curtain has fallen across the global industrial landscape. Yet, unlike the political barrier of the 20th century, the new curtain is made of very different materials, like 100% tariffs used to shield monopolies from competition, trade restrictions turned into geopolitical weapons to block the global integration of manufacturing and supply chains, and software kill switches built into everyday products that allow governments to use them as instruments of political power. Behind all of this is you, the American consumer. The middle and working classes have been isolated, locked into economic systems that leech their wages. They're blocked from accessing more innovative and eco-friendly alternatives. They are denied the ability to reduce their personal carbon footprints. They're monitored continuously by technologies that are more suited to serving national security agendas than making their lives easier. This is the true reality of the global economy today. Cheap Chinese cars weren't kept out of America to save you. They were kept out to preserve a system of corporate survival and geopolitical dominance, and you were left to pick up the bill. Chinese vehicles aren't the only threat facing Detroit's Big Three. Ford is struggling with shifting consumer demands, rising competition, and a rapidly changing automotive landscape. Discover what's really driving the decline and real reason why Ford is failing. Or watch this video.